Please join me in the flag salute.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, welcome everybody. It is that time of year to elect new board leadership, which is our first action item for the evening. So I will open that up. We do board chair first, right? Yep. Everybody on board for that? Yeah? Okay, I'll open that up for nominations for board chair.
This time I'd like to nominate. You'll get you. You go ahead.
How about we just every other word?
Sure. Well, it could be a strange name then, though.
I nominate Frida Christopher as board chair.
Is there any other nominations? Okay, I'm going to close nominations for board chair. Any discussion? Do we discuss these?
Not usually.
I don't remember. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, I'm going to open nominations for board vice chair.
I'd like to nominate Andrea Valderrama for board vice chair.
Any other nominations? Okay, nominations are closed. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? All right, that carries. And I think we all change seats now.
Before we do that, Christine, just real quickly, I get the privilege of thanking you and recognizing you for the last year of board chair and leading and guiding this board. There's a plaque to ultimately say thank you, but then to recognize your service and to recognize your leadership. Thank you for serving as board chair for the past year. You bet.
Push your mic button.
Sorry, I'm still getting used to these mics, but I want to welcome everyone. And our first item is our visiting delegation, and I don't believe we have any. And so it'll be audience participation or attendee input is what they want to call it now. Do we have any? Each of you have 3 minutes if you wish to turn in any written testimony or input. Besides that, you're more than welcome to. And we'll start off with Heather Franklin.
Hello. Okay, so following up on what I've been talking about a few board meetings in a row now and our discipline policies, I want to review, before I start talking, a few important facts I think that are helpful to keep in mind. First, it is well established through research, through academic research, that both in-school and more substantially out-of-school suspensions have direct effects on both academic performance and graduation rates. So the higher the overall rate, the lower the graduation rate, and both individually. The more a student is suspended or expelled, the less likely they are to graduate. David Douglas School District, middle and high school, suspend and expel students of color at rates disproportionate to their white peers. That's a fact. Third, David Douglas School District fails to graduate at least 1 in 4 students, and with the rates for students of color experiencing the most significant harm, more so than that 1 in 4 figure. So what I want to talk about and continuing on is the idea of trauma-informed practices and using best practices, which I don't believe we currently are. And when we're talking about trauma, the pediatric board usually uses the term ACEs, which is adverse childhood exposures, and we talk about the more ACEs a child experiences, the more harm that they have experienced in their life, the more trauma. And trauma is referred to as a cycle. So when a child experiences trauma, whether it be having to do with a housing crisis, having family instability, being in foster care, violence in their community or at home, racism, xenophobia, anything that we can think about that's like a negative impact on the kid, that's going to have psychological and emotional damage on that child. And from there, we can expect behavioral problems. And right there is where we really need to think about what are we doing as a school. So those behavioral problems can be looked at as defiance, as insubordination, as a number of things that we can see as a problem, see as a kid as a problem, or we can see it as an opportunity to help the child. And I really want us to start thinking about ways in which to help the children. Changes in daily routine is really hard for kids that come from a place of trauma. And so the last thing in the trauma cycle we talk about is punishment or discipline or whatever reaction. And the result of punishment, like, things like a suspension, in school or out of school, or an expulsion, is more trauma. And so the cycle perpetuates itself. So we can either try to stop trauma, or we can continue to perpetuate trauma. And I also want to talk about that the punishment in this district, I feel, is very unpredictable. Speaking from personal experience and speaking from talking to many, many other parents who go through similar things where, the kid might not even know what they're going to get suspended for and why they're getting suspended for certain issues, especially when their life has been unpredictable up until that point. And we spend a lot of time in these meetings talking about kids that are coming from hard places, but I don't think we spend a lot of time talking about how we're helping those kids, except for kind of in theoretical issues. So what I want to point to is one trauma-informed intervention that I think the state has done a really good job at, and that's how come I think our elementary schools are different than our middle school and our high schools. And that is Oregon Senate Bill 553, which went into effect in 2015. It was created specifically to reduce the rates of suspension and expulsion for Oregon students in K-5. And what it did was it amended existing statutes to first prohibit out-of-school suspensions and expulsions for kids in K-5, except for in the specific instances where A, a student causes serious physical harm to another student or a school employee through non-accidental conduct, B, an admin has determined that the behavior poses a direct threat, so a threat of violence, or C, as required by law. The second thing that this amendment does was required schools to take steps when students are suspended to reduce and avoid future suspensions so that academic loss is minimized. So we need to figure out what's going on with that kid and then figure out a way to mediate it, right, to change it so it doesn't happen again. And then third, standardize the manner by which all schools count student suspensions and expulsions. We saw last year's data that middle schools were different. Some schools were suspending at much higher rates than others. And why is that? Because people suspend children, right? So I really want to ask the board to consider extending Senate Bill 553 and the simple program that they use for K through 5 and just extend it out to middle school and high school. I don't think it's that difficult, and I think that it would have an immediate positive impact on all of our students in David Douglas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And you're invited to stay. We have discipline practice presentation later in the program. Okay, the next person is Craig Rogers.
Good evening. I brought a guest with me this evening, Donna Coleman. She's my eyes up on Salmon Street. That's at the end of the dead end. It's the top of what used to be a tent city, and in part because of her help, it is no longer a tent city. And in the name of full disclosure, because she might say something nice to me, it's important that I tell you I took her out to dinner before this meeting this evening. So I've got a lot of people coming on board with that situation of why it is not a tent city. And actually I have some maps. Some maps to hand out. That where the star is, up in the corner, I don't have a whole lot of this, is where the bad actor corner is. And then Scott, with the Southeast Portland Park Division. He and I, in the last 2 days, now that I've become aware of him, we're in conversation a lot. I feel things have the potential to move forward, and we'll see. So basically what he first told me was they don't have any money to cut down the blackberries or the boxwoods. It's kind of like buying a car and you can't afford to change your gas. And, you know, it's kind of like Portland City Hall's refusal to show spending discipline. And you got Sergeant Teague over there. Here's a recent Southeast Examiner, and he's saying it's only going to get worse. I know him. He's a straight talker. If you want to know really what's going on, you know, talk to a police officer. So I'll just tell you, you know, this is one of my letters to the editor. Wheeler's follow through. Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler can't follow through on his #1 priority, the homeless. So now he creates a diversion of solving clean air by blowing hot air. And here's a gentleman that got stabbed 17 times when we went out and asked the homeless person to move. It was putting up the tent for overnight across from his house. And the city must stand up to predators. So it's a predatory homeless, and that area up there, there's a tent city, is full of them. We've been confronted. Here's Larry. We've been confronted by them in a very aggressive way. And the next step would have been physical. There was Naked Man up there about 2 weeks ago, and after he left, we got to put the props out here. Here's the props. This is just from this year. Okay, Naked Man was up there, and after he left, here's stolen tax documents with Social Security numbers, birth certificates, appearances for court. This is why it's that important. Let me tell you, every one of you should be proud for supporting to improve the situation. It's a clear and present danger. I just found 2 needles the other day where you look out over the tracks. So somebody's up there shooting up, looking right over floodlights. All of you should be very proud for supporting Ken, Doug, myself. We're making improvement. Right now, there probably isn't a 10 up there. And we're all working together to improve the situation. And it's not easy. You got to make decisions, and you got to stand your ground. So thank you. Thank you. Let's continue to move forward and make Portland safe again.
Thank you, Craig. Next is Chris Conklin.
Hi, I'm Chris Conklin. As you might remember, a few months ago, my wife and I had children at Mill Park Elementary School. Since that time, the problems at Mill Park have gotten worse, not better, and the district leadership appears to be avoiding the hard work of caring about these children whose families can't do better for themselves. I've decided to transfer my family to a school in the district with a healthier environment for learning, and that I will continue to be a voice for the other 600 children at Mill who don't share the same privilege of exiting the school. A few months ago, I was asking for your help, but that's changed, and now I'm asking you to take responsibility for the education of those who need it most in our region. If I sound angry, it's because of my mistake in trusting you to take care of the education of my children. In moving schools, my 5th grader was tested and found to be halfway through 3rd grade in her math proficiency. How did she fall almost 2 grades behind with her parents diligently working with teachers and watching all reports? I brought a copy of her report card to show you if you're interested. As busy parents of 3 students, we have learned the grade system of the district and state and know that 3s and 4s are good and anything below needs improvement. We only see 3s and 4s, so how is our daughter so far behind? If you look at the math section of her report card, only a third of the categories is filled out with 3s and 4s, and the rest says NA. NA because the teacher was not able to teach. NA because the classroom was too disruptive. And NA because the children were too far behind to catch up to that point. If the teacher is too embarrassed to point out the NA, how are English learning parents going to catch the hint that they are just bringing their children to one of the worst places to educate their children in the state? In my opinion, Mill Park edges on being a glorified daycare center. Over 75% of Mill students are illiterate, and fewer than 15% of the Mill children are able to perform math at their grade level. I regret the trust that I had in you for my children. This should be your primary focus. I won't stop speaking out until you make the changes and prove that Mill Park children are educated to proficiency for success in our society.
Thank you, Chris. Next is Carrie Fellows. Oh, it's Larry. Oh, is it Larry? It looked like a C. Sorry about that.
I went to high school.
I'm here to support Craig Rogers' position about the overgrown area, and just simply put it, to put it simply, I would be worried about it for the children. I worked at the fire station over here for 19 years, and I've been in those dugout hidden areas, and you just need to shine the light like they did on the hill. And I know it's City of Portland property, but maybe I just would hate to read the paper one day that some child had gone down that trail like I did when I was a kid when I went to Floyd Light, down the trail and stumble on something that wouldn't be good. So, you know, it's not a big piece of land, it's not a lot of brush, it's a chance to remove a possible danger zone for some of the children. And I see a ton of children down there when I walk my little dogs down there. That track this time of year, and I would be even more worried about it when the days get dark at 4 o'clock and kids are coming home up the hill maybe from practice or something like that. To me, it's a dangerous place, and I won't take a bunch of your time, but I do want to thank you people for doing this. Holy smokes, this is really cool. I've never been to a school board meeting, and I thank you all for taking the time to do this. So anyway, I don't know what the procedure would be. I know the City of Portland is responsible and all that, but I think the neighbors would like to see done what was done on the Big Hill. They cleaned out the Big Hill, and it just opened up everything, and people don't feel comfortable hunkering down in there. And the people that are on that little stretch of trail down there, they're not the poor homeless that need a break, need a lift up. Those are lifers. They're not predictable people. They're not people you'd want your children around. So anyway, that's all I have to say. I just brought it to your attention. I don't know if it'll go anywhere from here. We'll keep track of it and work with you on it or whatever. Anyway, thank you guys. A little nervous. I've never done this before.
Thank you, Larry.
Madam Chair, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Maybe Mr. Rogers knows the answer to this, but so the property that's in question, the city owns that, and they're just letting it. I mean, it sounds like part of it's been cleaned up, but it's just overgrown. It's crazy.
Gotten overgrown, correct?
And they won't do anything about it.
Well,
Kind of in line.
I got a call back today.
Well, yeah, but you've been working on this for
Yeah.
at least
And
2
yet I'm
years.
Connecting the dots more and more. Scott, who's in charge of Southeast Portland Park, he talked to his bosses, and it sounds like we're on the right road. But I gave you those handouts, and if you could call Scott and let him know what your thoughts are about it, to possibly you support us and yourself to improve it.
But really, that's what we're talking about, is somebody go in there and clean up the vegetation.
Wherever they
yeah.
can hide, that's why I call it the bad actor corner where the star is.
Okay.
On that, it's bad. That's where I found all these stolen documents. There's even birth certificate. I mean,
Thank you.
In the needle.
Okay.
Get the needle.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is PERS bond review. Pat, I guess you can introduce our guest.
Yes, so you've seen her before, Carol Samuels with Piper Jaffray, and she's going to give you an overview. We have a presentation in the packet for you, and last month you received information on PERS obligation bonds.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see many familiar faces. I'm going to be working off of a presentation that looks like this. So hopefully everybody has a copy. And basically what I'm here to talk to you about today is one element of the PERS situation. Obviously, PERS is a complex situation that I could spend many hours talking about. I have spent many hours talking about, but tonight I'm primarily going to talk about side accounts, creating a side account, and the mechanisms available to you for funding a side account once it's created. So Just starting with some background information, a side account is simply a name for basically a savings account that is held at PERS on your behalf and is drawn down over a fixed period of time and used to pay your PERS bill. So it's kind of like having a credit on your Visa account, except that unlike with a Visa account where those funds would be drawn down immediately, there is a drawdown schedule that is created over 20 years, and it's used to reduce your annual PERS bill. There are some rules about setting up a side account. This was a big priority of the governor last year because her view is one way to reduce the overall bill associated with PERS is to put more money into PERS, so she prioritized liberalizing those rules. And the rules are now that to create a side account, a new side account, you need to have a minimum of $250,000 or 25% of your unfunded actuarial liability, which is a lot of words for your share of the shortfall, whichever is less. For you guys, that's $250,000 because your shortfall, unfortunately, is quite large. There are also some other rules and regulations associated with them, and there are some fees as well, most of which are nominal. Why might you want to do this? Well, predominantly because PERS has the opportunity to invest in a much broader array of investments than you can as a school district. As a school district, you're pretty much limited to what's considered safe treasuries, commercial paper, certificates of deposit, local government investment pool, things that are meant to stay liquid and available to you so you can draw down on them in a predictable way. PERS, on the other hand, is a $75 billion portfolio that invests in a whole array of securities, equities, fixed income, commodities, special equity, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a consequence, their rate of return historically is substantially higher than the rate of return that you might earn if you took your cash and put it in a T-bill. You can use bond proceeds, and we'll be talking a lot about that in a couple of slides, but you can also use cash to fund these side accounts. Fundamentally, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea to set up a side account really comes down to an analysis of the opportunity cost of the money you're using to fund the account. So if you're looking at cash, it's a balance between, do you think your cash is going to do better if you hold on to it versus sending it to PERS and having them invest it for you? That's a pretty straightforward analysis. I think most people feel comfortable that over the long term, PERS is going to do better on cash than you would be able to, but it's not without risk. PERS also has some experience losing money, which is, frankly, one of the reasons we have such a massive shortfall. With regard to bonds, it's also an opportunity cost, but the cost of the money is now no longer what you can earn on it, because that's cash, but rather how much does it cost you to get it? So what's your borrowing rate versus what do you think PERS is going to earn? If PERS is going to earn more than you borrow your funds at, then you can reduce the impact of your costs. Moving now to slide 3. There was a bill that was approved by the 2018 legislature to try and enhance the incentive to create these side accounts. Senate Bill 1566 created 2 key things that are relevant to you folks. The first is what they called an employer incentive fund, which is a really good idea. It created a $25 million fund that is designed to provide a match to local jurisdictions that create a side account. Fundamental problem with it is that it's only funded to the tune of $25 million. And unfortunately, the shortfall statewide is estimated to be $22 billion. That's, yes, billion with a B. So it's a good idea. It's not going to go very far. There are some priorities that the district does qualify for if your unfunded liability as a percentage of your payroll is more than 200%. You fall into the prioritized category. A lot of the details of how that's going to be implemented are still to be determined. PERS is working on the rules associated with that, but your percentage that's relevant is 271%. Again, 200% is the priority, and you are over that. How much might be available is unclear, but they will not match more than 25% of what you put in, and furthermore, the only match they will provide is for cash, not for bonds. So, not to editorialize, unfortunately, if you're in a position where you're cash poor, this is going to be tough to take advantage of. So, moving to slide 4, there was one other feature that is specific to school districts. The Employer Incentive Fund is available to all local governments, so cities, counties, special districts, and school districts. However, there is a special fund that is funded to the tune of approximately $115 million. The exact amount is still to be determined. That is going to be devoted to school districts uniquely. So basically what is going to happen is they are going to create a side account that is available for all school districts, which means you will all get a slight sliver off of your payroll costs because this account exists. It's a good thing. Again, I like the direction the state is going with this. Unfortunately, it's really going to be in the margins of your payroll costs because it has to be spread across 197 school districts. Okay, so moving to slide 5, let's talk about pension bonds. So as I mentioned before, pension bonds are another way of accessing funds to create a side account. Concept is calling a spade, what we in my business call an arbitrage play. It's the only legal arbitrage play you will ever have available to you. For the most part, this is not something that the federal government allows you to do. But in this case, the deal is you borrow at what you hope is a low interest rate, and you send the money to PERS. If PERS earns more on those funds than it costs you to access that over time, then all things being equal, you will come out ahead. You will reduce your costs over what would otherwise be the case. Unfortunately, if PERS loses money and the rate of return overall is less than what it cost you to borrow those funds, you can put the district in worse shape than you were by doing nothing. And unfortunately, David Douglas has some experience with this, which I will show you some of the examples on. The reason this is a legal arbitrage play, arbitrage being the opportunity to earn the profit, the spread over your borrowing cost, is because under federal tax law, unlike when you borrow to build a building, you cannot do this on a tax-exempt basis. You have to borrow through the taxable market. And since The investors who buy your bonds will have their bonds subject to federal income tax. The federal government doesn't care what you do. So that's why it is legal to attempt to do this. Page 6 gives you a snapshot of Oregon's history with pension obligation bonds. Quite a few Oregon jurisdictions have entered into the bond market historically for this purpose. In fact, over 100 employers, including David Douglas, issued pension bonds between 1999 and 2015, including the state of Oregon that borrowed $2 billion all by itself. Most school districts borrowed through a pool with other school districts whereby you enter into an agreement with the Department of Education to actually pay the debt service for you by diverting some of your monthly SSF dollar. That helps equalize the credit quality and makes investors more comfortable with it. And for the most part, positive returns since 1999 have meant that most Oregon municipalities that did this are ahead. Unfortunately, because of the timing of the borrowing, those jurisdictions, including David Douglas, that borrowed in 2007, and you borrowed in the fall of 2007, right before the stock market crashed in 2008, are behind. So you of all jurisdictions are really in a position to understand the consequences, both positive and negative, of going through something like this. Page 7 itemizes the listing of jurisdictions that have borrowed since 2001 with the amount that was borrowed, and in many cases, particularly the larger numbers where it says SD pool, those are school districts that all sold bonds simultaneously, as well as the interest rate. In my world, the all-in interest rate is called the true interest cost. That's why it says TIC. And you can see that in 2007, there's an asterisk right here. You borrowed at a rate of 5.67%. That wasn't the lowest over the term of these borrowings, but it also wasn't the highest. So page 8 we've already talked about. The only line item here that I haven't mentioned is that currently we are projecting borrowing rates sub 5%, just a little bit south of 5%. For all of the analyses I'm going to show you later in this presentation, we've assumed 5%. So better than the rate you borrowed at back in 2007, not as low as some who borrowed in 2015 were able to achieve. Page 9 shows you in very tiny print rates of return at the PERS fund, and if you want averages, look to the right. This is straight off the PERS website. I have no idea why they look at a 47-year average, but that's what's available. And you can see that the rates of return, even including this final line item, average return on side accounts between 2004 and 2015, which of course includes 2008, when the fund lost, wait for it, 27%. Despite that, the rates of return overall have been doing pretty well. The past year, the fund, if you do a look back from May to May, has earned 10.5%. I will note that the fund is actually down so far this year. If I had shown you this 1 year look back in December, you would have seen a 15% one-year rate of return. That's what the fund earned in 2017. I don't think I have to tell you that the market has been super volatile this year. So hard to know where that's going, but that's where we are as of this past year. And page 10 is a snapshot, a summary of an analysis that OSBA commissioned, largely because my firm, I know a lot about borrowings. I know a lot about borrowing rates. I do not pretend to be an expert on investments, and in many ways, this decision that you might make is really much more an investment decision than a borrowing decision similar to one you might do for a general obligation bond, because it's the investment side of the equation that is so important to whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea. So Echo Northwest was retained to do a probability assessment, an econometric model where they do 1,000 simulations based upon the current portfolio and the asset allocation of the current portfolio. And what you see here is an assessment of the probability of making positive arbitrage. That's what probability that present value is more than zero. Anything more than zero means you've made money. At 3 different interest rates, borrowing rates. So TIC, again, is the borrowing rate. And what Echo Northwest assessed was, what's the probability of success at a 4% borrowing rate, a 5% borrowing rate, and a 6% borrowing rate? And they looked at what if you deposit all of the money at one time versus what if you deposit it twice. So kind of a dollar cost averaging approach. And not surprisingly, your probability of success goes up the lower the interest rate. So for a 4% interest rate, your probability of success is around 80%, 5% interest rate around 70%, 6% interest rate around 60%. It goes up a little bit, not as much as I expected it would with this dollar cost averaging approach, but it's not materially different, certainly, if you do it in 2 tranches. Now, if you did it in 5, might that help? Unclear. But this is the assessment they provided. But if I haven't scared you enough already, just for full disclosure, there are other risks as well. The first is the one that hurt you guys more than any other, which is timing and compounding really matters. So you'll remember a couple slides ago I showed you that between 2004 and 2015, side accounts have actually earned more than 8%, despite the fact that there was a loss in the middle of nearly a third of the portfolio, yet your issue is still underwater. Why? Because there were 3 years before 2007 when the rates of return were positive. The worst thing that happened to you was you borrowed in October of 2007, and 3 months later, you dug an enormous hole. PERS dug an enormous hole for you. If you think that's about to happen again, now is not a good time to borrow. On the other hand, if you believe economists who say that the market still has a lot of room for growth, now might be a good time to borrow. What else do you have to think about? Well, even if you save money, and there are lots of jurisdictions that are in the metro area that have saved a lot of money, because it's not predictable what the market is going to do, how much you save in any given year is going to be volatile, very volatile. And even in years where you're ahead, If it's less than it was the year before, somebody is going to be unhappy because you're not making as much as you did the year before, and you may have built your budget around an assumption that things are going to continue in a certain way. And I'll show you some numbers to give you a flavor of that. Our view is that the way to deal with that kind of volatility is to have a reserve fund, but that's obviously really tricky to do in an environment where the state is not providing you enough money to operate the district. So it's a good idea. Some districts have been able to do it, others have struggled. Could PERS change in a way that affects this? It's hard for me to come up with a change that the legislature or the administrators at PERS could do, particularly now that there are so many jurisdictions with side accounts, that would hurt your side account, but I can't guarantee it. Certainly, PERS, as I said at the outset, is a very complicated system, and even things that are trying to fix it sometimes have inadvertent consequences, so that's something to think about. The prepayment issue, I'm thinking we have resolved, yay, so I'm about to take this off the list, but it used to be in 2007, when you sold bonds before, it was basically unheard of to have a prepayment provision that was economical for your bonds, because you were selling in the taxable market. So even though interest rates went down after you sold the bonds in 2007, you couldn't refinance it because in the taxable market at that time, they were not allowing prepayment provisions. That's been changing slowly, and I just had a conversation with our underwriter today, and he thinks that we can put a standard prepayment provision in, so that's good. Pension bonds take what is considered by some to be a softer liability, meaning if you don't pay PERS, could you work something out with them, some kind of payment plan? Probably. You don't pay your bonds, and that would be pretty ugly. So that's something to think about. And then just to remind you, you are eligible for the Employer Incentive Fund under Senate Bill 1566, but not for a bond-funded side account. Okay. Now I'm going to look at some specific numbers. Take a deep breath and put on your reading glasses because a lot of these numbers are super tiny. What this chart shows you is data that we find useful because it's simply taking valuation data that PERS produces every year for every school district and puts it all in one place so you compare from year to year. The top box looks at dollars owed. The bottom part of the box looks at those dollars translated into percentages that are paid against your payroll. So these are your payroll rates. At the very top, we start with system data. Then we go into school pool data. You are pooled with all school districts throughout the state. And then we get specifically into David Douglas. And I'm only going to focus on two columns on this sheet. I want to focus on the first column that says 2007. In 2007, David Douglas, okay, so I'm right here, had a total allocated pooled UAL. That's a lot of words for your share of the shortfall of $21 million, okay? But you had a side account that was funded in 2007 with a bond issue for $36 million. So for one moment, you actually had a surplus, $14 million surplus. If you then look at that same area on this chart and look at the 2016 data, you get a real gut-wrenching example of why this is in the newspaper every day, in that your share of the shortfall, even after taking out your side account, is almost $200 million. More than 10 times bigger what it was in 2007 before the crash. And effectively, all of this is due to the crash in 2008 and the delay in paying it back. Down below, if you want to see how that translates into payroll rates, you can again get a snapshot of the comparison looking at 2007 before the crash. Your rate was about 9% on Tier 1, Tier 2, somewhat actually higher on OPSERP, but roughly the same, so about 9%. Fast forward to 2016, and by the way, 2016 is not in effect today. It is an estimate of where your payroll rates are going starting in the 2019 biennium, 19 to 21. It's growing to over 30%, and I don't remember, Pat, do you pay pickup? You don't. Oh, well, that's a benefit. Some school districts that pay the employee share on top of it owe an additional 6% on top. So that's obviously a pretty considerable bite, and unfortunately, this is not the end of the increases. If the state does nothing to solve this situation, either on the revenue side or on the expenditure side, you can expect that rates 2 years from now will be another 4% higher. Aren't you glad you invited me?
It's always so depressing.
I like talking about building bonds way better. Okay, the next slide is for information only. It's an interesting factoid. PERS assumes that payroll in their model for every jurisdiction grows at 3.5% per year. You can see that on a system-wide basis, the system has not kept up with that, but David Douglas has. So that's both good and bad. When you grow faster than the rest of school districts, you actually get allocated more of the shortfall because the shortfall is allocated pro rata on the basis of payroll. So one of the reasons your share has grown so substantially is you are growing faster than school districts overall. Okay, now you really need to take a deep breath. We're going to take a look at your history with your past bond, which is on page 15. So again, to recap, in the upper left, you borrowed just over $38 million in 2007 at a rate of 5.67%. You deposited it in a side account, and everything went fine for the first 3 months. And then you immediately lost $9 million. That's really hard to recover from. And on the far right, you can see that as of the 2017 calendar year, our estimate is that you have lost about $1.9 million overall. And when you translate that to a present value basis, what it's worth to you today, it's about $1 million worse off than you are if you had done nothing. Okay? The next page runs a projection on the existing bond that makes an assumption that the system earns 7.2%, which is the rate of return that PERS assumes in their model. Used to be 8, and then it was brought down, and most recently it's 7.2% each and every year, keeping in mind that you borrowed at 5.67. So there is that arbitrage, but unfortunately, because of the timing of the loss, we anticipate that that's not enough to build out of the hole. You would have to earn more than 7.2% over the remaining period of the debt, which goes through 2028. If you only earn 7.2%, you would lose overall about $6 million. No, I'm sorry, about $8 million carrying forward the losses from the previous year, or $3.5 million on a present value basis. Okay, so, want to do it again?
No. Being one of those board members who got convinced to do that? No.
I hear ya. However, in the interest of full disclosure, we ran 3 different analyses that shows you experiences at a baseline level. If you were to do this again, the experience of some large school districts in the metro area in the middle column, and then basically your experience. So if you think about Goldilocks, you know, there's a medium case, a really good case, and a, not so great case. So what's the base case? The base case builds on the PERS model again and assumes that you're going to earn 7.2% in straight line fashion each and every year. So I can guarantee you this is not what's going to happen. You may earn 7.2% on average. You're not going to earn it every year. But if you were to earn it, and we are again assuming a 5% borrowing rate, and you borrowed the full amount of $198 million, in every year you would have a positive rate credit, and the overall savings to your payroll rate, so taking the rate credit you get from the debt, subtracting out the cost of the debt itself, because obviously you can't forget that, you would end up reducing your payroll rate by about 2.4% each and every year, for a savings overall of about $52 million. We throw in this percentage savings, PV savings percentage, because that's a way to measure refinancings. I know Frida has been through refinancings of GO bonds. You may remember there's this test that the state used to require, that the PV savings percentage on a GO bond had to be at least 3% before you could do a financing like this. So by that standard, this is a pretty healthy idea. Of course, unlike savings on a GO bond that are guaranteed, this is as far from a guarantee as you're going to get. So you expect and want to have a much higher projection of the percent savings. Okay, now let's talk about case 2, which is a real-life example of those who borrowed in 2002, their rates of return through and including 2016, and then assume 7.2% on the balance. If you were to do that, your savings would be even higher. And this is one of the reasons that some school districts are in much better shape vis-a-vis their PERS liability than others. If you looked at a listing of rates for PERS, there are still some that have payroll rates that are close to 0 because they borrowed in 2002 or 2003, where they had 5 years of really solid returns to balance against the 2008 downfall. And then case 3 is your experience. You take 2007 rates of return, you lose 27%, and then you build back. You're going to have another really sad story. Okay, so the next set of detailed pages are simply details on those three assumptions. I am only going to go over one of these so that you can understand how they work. Even though there are a lot of numbers, it's pretty straightforward. You would deposit, this is my baseline case where you earn 7.2% each and every year. You deposit 198 million. You earn 7.2%. You also pay debt, and you get a rate credit here of 18.5%. So that would go off of the projected 30% payroll rate. Your rate would be reduced by 18%. But because you're taking on debt, when you translate that debt as a percentage of payroll, that translates to about 16%. So your net savings are that 2.4%. And finally, on numbers, and then we can talk more qualitative, I did want to show you the happy case where you earn really good, strong returns for 5 years and then et cetera. Because I want to focus on this last column, which shows you the volatility I was talking about earlier. Even though this is a really happy story, you can see that, you know, some years the savings are 7.5% and then, you know, they drop to 5. If you don't have a reserve and you aren't expecting that, even though you're doing really well, you could be in a situation where there are a lot of sad faces. So that's why, if possible, if you do this, you want to build a reserve. Okay, so turning to slide 21, I am almost done, I promise. If you decided you want to do this, we are working with some school districts to move ahead, and we are putting together a pool. Going in a pool means that there are economies of scale, and also the workload is less, but it's not required that you go through a pool, so you do not have to play on this timeline. But if you wanted to move ahead with the other districts that have already committed to moving ahead, by the end of last month, you had to request an analysis from PERS, this is part of their deal, that costs $1,250. They take 45 days to deliver it, so that's why we're getting it so early. And by July 31st, we would need you as a board to adopt a resolution authorizing the sale. Now, it's not a commitment to go forward. You have the opportunity to back out, but it is certainly meant as giving staff the indication that as long as the interest rate in the resolution is not exceeded, and you get to pick what that interest rate is, they should move forward and put the sale together. We expect to get the actuarial analysis from PERS by the end of August, and then we hope to be in the market in September, again, assuming the market cooperates and the interest rates that districts have set. Under this timeline, you would actually see your payroll rates be reduced effectively immediately. If we are able to close the issue in October, you would see your payroll rates go down November 1st. And that's what I had.
Thank you, Carol. Questions?
It's a lot, I know.
Yeah, thank you. This is really helpful. The scenarios in particular are very, very helpful. My degree's in philosophy, so this is a great exercise in numbers for me. I think I have a grasp of the risks involved, and I have an understanding of the history as well. I have a question for you about to what extent we have any authority or direction with PERS with socially responsible investments. Do you have a clear answer for that?
I don't have a complete answer. I can tell you that the Oregon Investment Council is responsible, which is a subset of the state treasurer's office, is responsible for choosing the investments that the PERS fund is invested in, and socially responsible investments are not a priority. They have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize returns. Whether or not it could be made to be a priority, I don't know the answer to. So,
Okay, thank you. And is it public record which other school districts are already locked into the pool?
Nobody is locked in.
Okay.
So I do want to emphasize that I'm not going to force anybody to borrow if at the end you say I have cold feet, because you really have to be comfortable moving forward with the risk profile. But the districts that have decided they want to take the next step and have approved resolutions include Park Rose, Scappoose, Junction City, and Napa. We have a collection of 3 or 4 that are in your position where they are considering it. So it's not a huge group, and it tends to be a group of districts who have not done this before.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Questions?
Carol, I take it that these bonds are non-callable?
No,
Oh.
my expectation is they will be callable. That's what I was talking about earlier in terms of the prepayment provision.
Right.
They were not
Okay.
in the past.
I guess that's why yeah.
Yeah.
But, and then what would the call fee, can you elaborate just a little bit on the call feature?
The expectation is that the call feature will be identical to a call feature on a regular municipal bond, which is 10 years at par, meaning that after the 10th year, you can prepay it with no penalty.
Questions? Christine?
Does anyone have a rich uncle with $200 million? That's scary. That's a lot of unfunded liability.
Well, this doesn't have anything to do with the proposal, but I mean, I guess I just would add the disgusting financial problem that the State Investment Council, that the contracts in place that the state has endorsed and made over the last 30 or 40 years. We are in a terrible world of hurt with no good place to go. And I know it's beyond the school district, but if the school district through Ken or through us as taxpayers, as voters, we can clean up this mess. I mean, it's more than, well, we saw the numbers. It's crazy. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in.
And we don't have a lot of control.
No.
So, just kind of your opinion, being that I was there when we did in 07, no one expected the housing market to take the crash in 08. And given our current administration is loosening everything up, that could result in another housing crash because the restrictions that are put in are being loosened. I'm kind of hesitant because we're at a very peak to take on this when there is such a potential, because it's been a nice run. I got to admit, my 401k has done wonderful, but I'm waiting for something more than a 10% correction in the market. You know, there's too much going out there. And if that could occur, say, within a year, we'd be in the same situation we were last time, with a big loss to start out with.
So I have made it a policy to not make recommendations on this subject because I am not an expert in the investment side of the arena. That's one of the reasons I was really pleased that OSBA retained Echo Northwest to do their econometric model. Certainly, we have economists, both within Piper Jaffray as well as outside of Piper Jaffray, who think that this economy has room to grow. It is also true that the stock market has had a nice run up, although there has been a bit of a correction this year. So I guess what I would say is if you think that we're headed for another correction, you probably don't want to do this. On the other hand, if you don't do this and the market continues to improve, even if there's a correction 2 or 3 years from now, you may have lost basically the only opportunity that you as a school district have to help defray some of these costs. I mean, the bottom line is that whether you decide to do this or not, it's not going to solve the problem. We need the state to come in and do something much more significant to help all jurisdictions out of this. I don't think there's any question. But is this something you could do around the edges? Maybe.
Well, you've offered two options. One is selling the bonds and funding it all at once, or doing a side account where I'm assuming, if I read that information right, you put so much cash in each year, but then that would not bring down your rate as much. I'm trying to figure out, I couldn't quite understand when I was reading that.
Correct, because your first deposit is amortized based on 20 years, and your future deposits then are based on what's left of that amortization period.
Right.
So you're not going to get as much bang for your buck. And I know
Or lose
one
as
of the
much.
things that...
Or lose as much.
Yeah. Because one of the things that I've talked about with Carol and with some other folks is the potential of, and a few people have looked at me like I'm a little nuts, and I talked to my former boss, who she knows today, and he's like, oh, I kind of like that idea, is that should you actually structure this and you receive that 2 or 4% increase difference, you actually take that difference, still charge it, and put it into a cash account to help hedge on those other sides where things come, maybe not as well. Now, it won't help you in the case, I mean, it will help a little, but it won't help you in a case where you lose 30% in the first 3 months. And, he was quite funny because he couldn't understand why I was having such a problem with this, because Salem Kaiser did very well. That's where he's from. And so then when I showed him the numbers, he was like, now I know why you have a conundrum. So anyhow. But, I think if this is something you want to go with, and this might make Carol squirm a little bit, is I would, in the resolution, reduce the rate to probably 5%. And then that way they aren't going to sell bonds unless they are less than that 5%. That gives you a larger amount between that 7.2 and what you're selling the bonds. And then I would talk about how do we also look at doing that cash side account, taking advantage of the little bit that you might get from the state in their pool, and trying to hedge your bet, because this, if I'm correct in my bienniums as we get farther and farther along, you saw the next biennium is up from 23 to 30. My understanding is the biennium after that is another 4 to 5.
Right.
Then after that, it's kind of a bit of a hit and miss. We think it's going to level out and possibly start going down as we see those tier 1 and those of us that are tier 2 exit. So have I got that?
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that, we all got this. And so, Pat, help me if I'm wrong. We're thinking about selling some bonds to the public, taking that money and giving it to the PERS board, in Oregon Investment Council. If the market goes belly up or loses 20% or 10 or whatever, or just more than our rate, we have locked ourselves into a very bad situation. And so, I mean, I guess I look at it and I say, why would we give money to these people who have not done a good job?
Just because they've done a better job over time than what we would be able to do with that.
Over time, yeah, but what's that time?
Well, again, that's
Not over the last 10 years.
we are at a point where we are looking at options because we're about to pay 34% payroll costs.
Right. I guess what I'm saying to my fellow colleagues on the board is, what other options do we have outside of doing this? Is bankruptcy an option? No, I mean, when do we start talking about the inevitable with this whole PERS situation?
It's really a state issue. That
It really is a
solved.
state issue, but and that's not something that we don't want to do that, but
So our issue, right, and you mentioned it, and I think you and I have talked about this, and you and I have talked about this, but here's the thing, right? That promises were made to people who are diligent public servants, right? Absolutely. We owe them that. But promises were made to every family in this state that we would educate their kids. And the state is not fulfilling that requirement
not
by
hardly.
any means. So this is a state issue, but just like every other state issue when it comes to public education and School District 40, we're stuck with it. It's our problem. So we have to come up with ways to be able to do this. Or, as she's mentioned a couple times, whether we do this or not, we're going to come up against some years. We have 2 more bienniums before this thing is allegedly going to level out, right? I mean, I think Pat's being a little optimistic, which I like very much. Think about that. We're going to be paying over 30% of somebody's salary into not FTE, which is why I very much appreciate Pat bringing. I don't know that I like it. While you were speaking, I was going through some of those amortizations, and I appreciate you bringing it. I'm not saying I'm opposed to it for sure, but the opportunity, even though Frida has experienced the negative side of it, the opportunity to reduce that even by 2% is substantial. I mean, we're talking about a lot of money, a lot of FTE, because really that's what it is. When we talk about money, we're talking about FTE. We're talking about teachers in front of students. We're talking about safe buildings, all these things, right, which we know that. But I completely agree with you. The state has
and I know
dropped
that,
the ball.
Yeah, my comments are more out of frustration. It's not that we can solve the state's problem. State has to solve it, but let that be a lesson for all of us that it's going to affect everything in our homes, our value of our homes, our taxes, our livability in the state. Anyway.
I do have a concern because I know you're saying the economists, whoever you're talking to, is saying there's a lot of growth. I sit on the board citywide budget committee. Their economists aren't so optimistic. They think we've almost hit the peak, and the city needs to start looking at the reduction. They're not looking at it flying high, so for much longer. So it sounds like we're not just asking for an actuarial study. We have to make a choice whether to jump in and sell the bonds.
If you want to be on the same timeline as the other districts that are moving ahead, And one other thing I will note is you don't have to approve the full amount. Another option is to borrow less.
So ultimately, we brought this to the attention of the board because we didn't want to just ignore it, right? It's risk versus reward, reward versus risk, whichever way you want to look at it. And to be quite honest, I don't necessarily have a recommendation either because I can't see the crystal ball. It's really as a board together discussing this through what we're talking about. What Kyle just said, though, that 2%, 2.5%, 1.9%, whatever it is, I think I heard a number of about $52 million. That's real dollars. But again, risking for that, we've unfortunately been there in 2008, and most of us weren't here, but some of us were. And I think the next step is for the board to have a discussion about, do they want to move forward? Carol, I want to ask you, I think I heard this a little bit, and I'm not recommending this, but could we technically approve to continue exploring, or is that really not in good faith? It's either approve and you're going, because I think what I'm hearing is a lot of reservations that we need to.
Yeah.
So if, and again, I don't speak for the board, we haven't gotten there yet, but could we technically go through possibility of approving, knowing that as we continue to explore this, it didn't fit, or?
As I said before, even if you decided you wanted to approve this enthusiastically tonight, you know, we get to mid-September and you're having cold feet, you will have the opportunity to back out. I think the big question is, sometime pretty soon, we're going to need to put work on Pat's shoulders. And you know, can I tell you that if you move ahead, or if you even want to adopt a resolution in August, assuming that your August meeting is fairly early, that I can work with that? Absolutely, I can work with that. But I am going to start putting demands on Pat's shoulders. So that's just something, I mean, if you really don't think this is something you want to do, I'm sure she'd prefer to have you state that.
What would be the benefit of moving ahead with the actuarial study?
You've already done that.
Well, I've already done that, that's right.
So, yeah, we talked about that last month, and so we've moved ahead, and we're actually having them look at both cases of putting in a cash deposit of $2 million, and then also doing a full sale and depositing. So that is in process, and it should be at Milliman. And we're expecting that about the end of August, I think.
One note, Pat, if there is interest in exploring, say, doing half the issue or a quarter of the issue, we should get in touch with them, because that's not an analysis they're running. So,
Can you explain to me again the benefit of going into the pooled version? You said we could go in by ourselves. Do we get a better benefit of going in the pool, or is it just administrative costs are lower? And because that seems like that's what's driving this timeline, is getting in this pool. And so if there's hesitation and we need to discuss it more, and we say, yeah, we want to do it, but we want to do it in November. I mean,
let me put it this way. Your liability is large enough that all by yourself you would have the size that would get attention from investors. Okay. So you have a lot more flexibility. You would save a little money by going in the pool, because there are certain fixed costs that get spread. Mm-hmm. But in the scheme of things, it's not going to be a material difference.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we are so large compared to Park Rose, and those districts, you other districts are pretty small, we're really going to end up as a proportion, the larger proportion of the administrative costs, no matter what.
Mm-hmm. But if we were to choose or consider the option of selling a portion, would that make it a little bit more risky to go in alone, or would then it make more sense to be pooled?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how small you get. You know, if you decide you want to do a $10 million issue, then I can guarantee you'd be better off going in the pool. If you're talking about doing a $50 million issue, chances are you'd be better off going in the pool. But if you want to do half, you're still going to be fine going by yourself. So I do encourage you to take your time until you're comfortable. Just know that if you can get comfortable, either with Ken's version where you go to the next step and then you come back and consider it again, but we continue to operate as if you're doing this, you may save a little money doing it that way.
Do you have a sense of, so you told us who was considering the pool for this particular time, if we wanted to discuss and we were taking our time and we decided in February, would there be a new group of schools going into a pool that we could, that would, I mean, it sounds like we're the big player on the money loss here, and so maybe somebody would want to be in our pool because they do have the $50 million thing and it would be attractive to them to be in a pool with us.
I don't know if it's going to make you feel better, but there are many districts with much larger liability.
I'm sure, but I mean, if we're attractive enough to create a pool around our giant debt,
we often interest in borrowing revolves around new data from PERS.
Okay.
So every time PERS puts out an analysis showing how big the hole is, I get phone calls. And that is, in fact, what prompted us to start looking at a new pool again. Now, we started this effort in January. So I can't say for sure there won't be other pools. There could well be. It's just that it takes a fair amount of lead time to put them together.
Or pool party.
And it's harder to be nimble.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions of Carol or Pat? Of course, I got Bryce over there asking a side question.
I do. I have a question.
Oh, you're making
Pat.
a side deal. Okay.
So, Pat, aside from Section 2.4, where you're throwing out a possible recommendation for a change in the interest rate, my assumption is, I guess I'll say it this way, that's the only recommendation you have for a change for the document in front of us?
I would say so. If you decide to change the amount you're borrowing, that will change the amount you're saving.
Absolutely.
So, we can explore that. They just haven't had time. That was something that got thrown at me today, and I was like, I don't know, because it's a couple percentage points that you're saving, and the more you whittle that down, the more is it worth it to go?
Right.
But that's my opinion.
Okay.
But what you're recommending is to make the change under 2, if I'm finding it right, 2.4 to 5 from 5.5. Bonds shall not
Reduce
be
it
sold
to
at
5.
a true interest rate cost more than 5.
That would be my recommendation.
And as you said, if we get cold feet after reviewing some more information or more information coming from PERS, or unfortunately our economy takes a dump because of some, in my opinion, unwelcome types of policy changes at the federal level.
Although, the irony
Yeah.
is one could argue that the best time to do this is right after the economy has.
After the what?
That's what we're talking about.
Right after
Oh,
the economy.
Well, I
if
know
it tanks, that's when you want to do it.
And that's what happened when they bought in two, because that's when the .com tanked, and then they sold them right afterwards, and that's why they had the huge growth.
But it's hard. I remember back in 2008, I started getting phone calls, and it's like, you want to double down now that you've lost 30%? It takes a huge leap of faith in the middle of a recession to say, oh, okay, I think we're on an upward glide path. But if you had borrowed in 2008, you would be way ahead right now. So
a question. I know that obviously for competitive reasons, the 5.5 is established because we want to sell the issue. But it seems like that might be a little high in today's market, where the 10-year Treasury is at 2 7/8. So why, or is it, why are we out there at 5.5?
So The 5.5 is a little arbitrary. That is the maximum that other districts, and one other district that has decided to move ahead is Portland Community College, which does have a liability of about the same size as yours. And they are going independently because they're not a school district, so they can't enter the school district pool. And their CFO decided that 5.5% was the place he was comfortable. So that's the number that everybody else has used. I won't say there's any science to it necessarily, except that at the time, our estimates of cost were just under 5%. The market has gotten a little better. As you note, treasuries have come down, and these are priced in relationship to treasuries. So, you know, when we were looking at numbers today, it was more like 4 3/4, because there is a spread for municipal bonds. But I wouldn't say there was any magic to the 5.5.
Yeah, so, I mean, I realize that it's got to be established at a certain point. Is that point September? Or?
Well, the purpose of putting a maximum in the resolution is so you can give guidance to your staff when you are comfortable with them pulling the trigger, particularly since given the long lead time between tonight and when we're actually going to be in the market, which is much longer than we would typically have for a bond. Usually we can do a bond in 8 weeks. But because we're talking about a 3-month lead time, we have over the years developed a premise where you get to set the maximum, and that gives guidance to your staff whether or not they can move ahead without having to come back to the board. That doesn't mean you can't change your mind later, but, you know, again, we're trying to make sure that the work that Pat and Ken are going to have to do in terms of putting documentation together and talking to the rating agencies is done because you feel pretty good about moving ahead at whatever the maximum rate you are comfortable setting is.
How do you feel?
Yeah. So I think we're right to be cautious just based on our history. I don't think that I would feel opposed to keeping our options open right now. I will say, because we are a public body and from a values and community benefits perspective, that socially responsible investing is important to me. So I would want to get information about that. Beyond that, I think I would want to hear from Ken and from the rest of you around how comfortable you are. I'm not feeling very embracing of the risk right now, but that's where I'm at. I can be swayed.
So everything is predicated on how you think things are going or will go, right? We're talking about gambling, essentially.
Yeah.
And I just have to say, although we have seen markets improve and et cetera, there has been volatility. We have trade wars. We are not in an island unto ourselves as a country, and we have Brexit. We have lots of change and volatility. Some may say, great, bigger returns, more opportunity. I'm not comfortable. That's just how I'm feeling.
Bryce?
Well, I think I've said probably pretty much let the cat out of the bag how I feel. I think that there isn't really a good solution. But I don't know how I was thinking that I'd vote against this, but on the other hand, I don't know how we can not do it and stay fiscally, stay fiscally sound. So I kind of like the idea of being able to tiptoe in a little bit, and maybe that's the way we should do it. It's according to the projection, it was like 198 million, but we could. Pat, what do you think the minimum is that we could do to make it feasible for us.
I would say you'd probably have to do at least half.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So,
Okay.
anyway,
Just getting some opinions before I ask for a vote or anything.
So first, definitely want to pursue the cash version where we get some matching, right? So that's separate. I want to talk about that. I have no need to be in the pool. It's immaterial what we're going to save. Plus, we're our own pool with the size that we would be doing, even if we did a portion. Okay, so that said, we can approve this and not do it. That we're not binding ourselves to anything. We are creating a pathway that if we see we see our way to do this, we are already in process. I do my best to not put work on the superintendent's office or the cabinet, or at least I try to. In this instance, I'm not overly concerned that we go forward with this and they have to start something that then we stop. I'll simply apologize. Okay? I do not have a problem. I do agree with Pat's recommendation. The larger the spread, the better we're going to be. So dropping it to 5%, I have no problem doing that. I don't have a problem approving this tonight. In fact, if this comes up, I'm going to vote yes because I don't have to do it later. We can have conversations outside of this individually, having questions. We can reach out to Pat and we can discuss this publicly the next time we meet and have plenty of time to call and say, hey, you know what? We changed our mind. Mm-hmm. Right? That's entirely fine. My absolute feeling on this is when we talk, you and I specifically, because I kind of see things a little bit your way, is I absolutely want to do this after it tanks. I mean,
if honestly, that crystal ball.
If we think it's I'm going to say this: if we think there's going to be a correction of any magnitude in the next 3 years, we wait. Now, again, I say we. We all know I'm not going to be here. I say we wait as a board because we're not losing the $52 million, right? We're pushing the $52 million. We're losing access to some return right away, which is why we're going to look at the cash investment. We're not out materially the total mark. It's still going to be a 20-year obligation that will still pay off, that would pay off higher if the correction happened and then we did this. So I've talked long enough. I will tell you I have no problem approving this today at the 5% and apologizing later if we put a hold on it. So that's my feeling. That's if a motion is called.
I'm just getting the feel because if it's not going to go.
So, yeah, I'm not feeling super awesome about this whole plan, but I know we need to do something. So if we approve this resolution tonight, then it'll come somehow, some decision-making process will come back to say, yes, we want to move forward, or no, we don't. I mean, generally in the past, if we would have approved this resolution, Pat would have just ran with it. And, like you guys would have just done it. And if everything was under the 5%, go, go, go. Right. So at what point does it come back to the board for us to say, we're feeling even worse about it than we did tonight. We don't want to do this. And then also the cash option to get the matching funds. I mean, obviously we're not flush with money, but I'm interested in that as a concept. And I would like some of the state's money if we could get it. So that's not really an answer of whether I'm in favor of maybe approving this tonight as long as we get some more decision-making in. And if we approve this tonight and we don't want to go in the pool, then can we just stretch it out? Like, this resolution's been approved, so can we just, set it there and say, well, we're not comfortable doing this in September, push it out a little further? I'm trying to hedge my bets here, obviously, which is not really an option in any of this.
I hear you.
So, a couple of responses. You are correct that typically the way documents work, and this document is no exception in its current form, what you approve authorizes staff to move ahead with this financing as long as the maximum interest rate you set is not exceeded. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't amend this resolution to say, and you must bring this back to us before you move ahead, or you could just know that they're hearing you loud and clear that you want to have another opportunity. If you should decide that you want to do a borrowing, but you don't want to do it through the pool, this document doesn't actually work because it authorizes you to enter this pool. Now, that's not to say that bond counsel can't get you an individual borrowing resolution, but you would need to take second action. Okay. And then the final thing I'll say, sorry to interrupt you again, is on the match funds, we will know a lot more about the availability, how much you might get, how the priority system is going to work, when you might get it in October. So I'll be able to get you some information at that time.
Yeah, I just think more specifically, Christine, to your question, what I'm hearing and my understanding and belief is if this does, and I'm not saying this to recommend that it passes, that's not what I'm saying, but what I'm hearing, if it does go forward with approval, what my understanding is we will come back monthly with updates before any action's taken, right? So at this point, what we're hearing is move forward. That gives us the authority to move forward with the work, but what I'm hearing loud and clear is next month we'll come back with any update, whatever possible changes, more information. We might receive individual questions from board members that we want on the agenda of next time. We might have board leadership, but what we're saying is there will be an agenda item next month if this is approved, and if that updates us where we're at, and then based on that update, if there's a change, a different decision made, and it's almost based on the timeline we saw, I think monthly all the way up possibly through October when we'll know more about the cash. So depending on where we're at.
So I think I'm also in agreement that I'm willing to move forward with the resolution now, given exactly what Ken has also just stated, that we will get an opportunity to come back and review this next month, get our questions answered. I also like the fact that we would possibly be getting more information in October as well. I think that is all going to be helpful for me, because at this point, quite frankly, I haven't quite decided what I would like to do, but I do know that this moves us somewhere. And given that we do have rising PERS costs, given that there is a very big need for, a larger conversation at the state around revenue reform, I would I think be concerned if we weren't exploring the possibility of being able to do something even though it's minor. So to me, I think I would feel fairly fine given kind of the parameters that we shared right now. And then again, just echoing that I really like your idea as well around the cash side account. That's great. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's kind of some of my general thoughts.
It sounds like there's somewhat of a consensus here. I'm assuming what we need to do is, when the motion's made, that we amend it to read 5%. So I guess I'll call for a motion.
I move approval of resolution number 1.
Did?
You're going to amend it to 5%? You have to state that.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I move approval of resolution number 1 pending an amendment of section 2, part 4, taking the 5.5% interest rate down to 5%.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, is there any further discussion? Comments? Since I'm the only one who experienced that cliff. I'm hesitant, but as long as we have some outs. Okay.
So then, yes, as discussion, I would just ask that board leadership ensure that this is on the agenda every meeting until October.
Okay.
And I would ask also, sort of in the spirit of what Andrea was saying, to connect this exploration to our larger explorations around PERS and revenue options, just so that we're not thinking of this as our only saving grace.
Yeah. Christine, do you have anything? Nope. Okay. So it's moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
You-
I am opposed.
Okay.
It does not.
You wanna-
Nay. It doesn't
Okay.
feel to me the right vehicle, the right time. This is a long-term problem, and it feels a little desperate. That's just my feeling. But I agree, Bryce, that we need to. I don't have a $200 million cousin that's about to kick the bucket. We do need to explore options. This doesn't feel like the right one at the right time, personally.
Well, given it's past 6-1, given that it is something will be updated every month, and if we choose, say something really happens with the market, we can bail. Okay.
Even if something doesn't happen.
With the market, we can bail.
Yep.
I have a strong feeling. I just am waiting for that. It's just been too much on a rise. Carol, thank you for all your time. I know it's just riveting conversation, but
Well,
but
thank you for your patience.
Okay, we do have things out of different order because we're to superintendent's report.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, maybe we jump to this, just because I know we have a bunch of folks in the audience.
I'll do that now and then do the little.
And then my stuff, if it's okay with you.
Oh,
we'll
it's-
ask the board,
it's-
just
oh.
because I know we're admin, and I believe we have some parents that are interested.
Okay.
In
Do you want to take a 5-minute break?
That's up to you.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to move item 10, discipline practice presentation, up. But given that we've been going for almost 2 hours, I want to take a short 5-minute break, comfort break, as Annette used to say. And then we'll come back and we'll do the discipline presentation. So those of you that are staying for that won't have to stay while we get rid of this, do other business. So 5-minute break.
in David Douglas. So tonight, as I mentioned, we have about 20 minutes. So you want to think we're doing a 60,000 foot level of discipline. So imagine, like we're looking down onto the forest, and if we had all day, we would be analyzing the pine needles there on the ground, but we just don't have that. So we're going to be looking more 60,000 foot level this evening. And it's my pleasure and privilege, as Superintendent Richardson mentioned, we have a few of our administrators here who work daily for the betterment of our kids. We have Vice Principal of Alisat, Tay Spears. We have Principal of Earl Boyles, Erica Ganay. We have Principal of Menlo Park, Kelly Burkhart. Principal of West Powellhurst, Susan Olds. Principal of Floyd Light, Mr. Doug Pease. And Vice Principal of Ron Russell, Larry Tu. So thank you all for coming. And so we have a packet, too, that is in front of you that I'm going to go through very quickly of what's inside. The first page you have says student conduct. These are some board policies to start off. The next page is student discipline. The following 3 pages, folks, are our David Douglas School District referral procedure. In the middle of this packet, you see something that looks like this, and this is our secondary matrix for major behaviors that we're going to refer to this evening. The back of that is our elementary matrix. Next up, we have a page about board policy about suspension, and then the final 3 pages are our David Douglas flow chart for behavior support. Okay, so we'll be referencing all of those, as I said, fairly quickly in the next 20 minutes or so. So what I'd like you to do is to take a look at the screen. There's a quote that we pride ourselves with David Douglas students. It's by Ham Janat, and Ham was an author and psychologist, and I read this because it really sets the stage on why we have such a tremendous impact as staff members in David Douglas. The quote says, "I've come to a frightening conclusion. I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. As the teacher, I possess tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. But in all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated and a child humanized or dehumanized." So again, a tremendous impact. Here's our ultimate goal you see on the screen. That is that our students are productive citizens and also that they graduate from David Douglas. This is our grad walk this year on the left side, Ron Russell students on the right side, and it's kind of difficult to see, but those are that's at Cherry Park. So when you think about, we have board policy, you hear about systems that we have in place at our schools, but really none of the policy, none of the systems are going to be effective whatsoever if we don't have the right attitude with our kids. And so we pride ourselves in having that attitude in David Douglas. We think it's something that separates us a little bit from other districts, and we really have you as our board to thank for supporting that. I'll read those 4 things in David Douglas. Our students come first. Creating a safe and positive culture is the backbone of each of our schools. We pride ourselves on forming relationships based on trust and mutual respect that allow us the gift of influence over time, and that's a key phrase there, is the gift of influence. And then we believe in our students, and we never, ever give up on them in David Douglas. So when you think about discipline, you think about the beginning of the school year. Every teacher does this. So look at that picture there. That's before the school year starts at Ventura Park Elementary. You can see the papers totally centered on the desk right by the name tag. Everything looks great, ready for those kids to come. We know as teachers what we're going to teach. On the left, you see Common Core standards. We know what we're supposed to do. Even on the right, we know how to plan it. We have a lesson plan there ready to go that's engaging. Now, we have this vision of an optimal environment in David Douglas. You're going to see on the right side, those are students in our classroom. That's what we hope to have happen. Students working maybe behind that teacher. There's a group of 25 more students working independently. In the middle there, that's our own Miss Kelly Devlin. And she is connecting with our families because we know that's a huge part of what we do is connecting with families. So we have this optimal environment to make it all happen. Our teachers are making their rules. Okay, that's not really what they do. But we have a board policy here that we pride ourselves on, this around student conduct. And I'm going to read this and quote it from it. The objectives of disciplining any student must be to help the student develop a positive attitude towards self-discipline, realize the responsibility of one's actions, and to maintain a productive learning environment. So then the reality comes. And we have our classrooms ready, and if I were to show you a picture of after the first day of school, you would see pencils everywhere, crayons misplaced, books everywhere. Why? Because it's an active learning environment, we would hope. But the reality is, when I got married, my grandma, who I was very close to, sat me down and said, you know, Andy, I'll never forget her telling me this. You put two people in the same room, it ain't always going to work out. And she was right. But I think about that with schools. We have some big schools in David Douglas. We have some elementaries pushing 600. We have some middle schools pushing 900. We have biggest high school in the state. You put that many kids together, there will be some mistakes. And so none of us are perfect, kids and adults too. So with that said, what's next when that happens? Well, one thing I'm going to hold up for you is our Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. This was developed by our administrators and our teachers, and it's a group that developed this years ago, and it's updated yearly. It includes general expectations for systems of consequences designed to correct student misconduct and promote acceptable behaviors. So it's communicated to families at the beginning of the year, and it's posted on our website. One of the things that we know when it comes to our policy, our practices in Douglas, our policy around student discipline says the major objectives of the district discipline program are to teach the following fundamental concepts for living. Number one, understanding and respect for individual rights, dignity, and safety. Number two is understanding the respect for law, board policies, administrative regulations, and school rules. And then three, understanding of and respect for public and private property rights. So that comes directly from student discipline board policy, and what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Florence to talk a little bit more specifically about what happens within the school environment and in the classroom.
So I don't know if I need that. As Andy's already mentioned, that creating a positive culture is key in our schools, and it is truly the foundation of setting up classrooms and building those relationships with our students. And to achieve that through a lens of expectations, it's important that teachers set up clear expectations. And setting up clear expectations can be achieved by setting up routines, setting up procedures, making sure that students know the why of why they are there. The teacher knows of why they are teaching. What do they get into education for? Like truly that heart and soul. In addition, setting up those clear expectations is going to vary based on the teacher style. It may be that they have everything ready to go and the students walk in and they're going to start teaching, or it may be that they build those expectations with students. It could depend on style, it can depend on level. We do give our teachers that flexibility in figuring out how they want that to look. Another key component of setting up our systems is teaching. We need to teach students what we expect. We cannot expect that kids are going to come in ready to go and know everything that the teacher wants. And so it's important that we teach that. We reinforce what we are looking for. We get what we look for. So we work with our staff in reinforcing the behaviors that we want to see more of. We spend time reteaching expectations, and as Andy said, sometimes we make mistakes along the way, and so we also work on correcting behaviors. And how we correct those behaviors varies from the classroom. Teachers set up their own in-class systems on how they work on correcting those behaviors. Sometimes it may be timeout forms. Sometimes that may be a buddy classroom where they send a student to another class. Sometimes it's daily communications via emails with parents or phone calls when something happens. The spectrum in the classroom varies from teacher to teacher, but there is an expectation that there is something within that classroom. Another way that we correct behaviors is using something called a minor. Minors are classroom managed behaviors, and then we also have majors, which are office managed behaviors. In your packet, you'll see a flow chart on kind of the referral procedures. There are two tracks kind of off of that. Essentially, there's the minor, which are classroom managed behaviors, and those vary. They're like the little things that teachers can handle. They work with the student, they get things figured out, and they move on. If behaviors are continuously kind of coming on and they're now moving on to a chronic, then it may need to escalate to something more. Each of these classroom managed behaviors and examples are taught at the beginning of the school year to staff. There are also definitions in your packet of what would be a minor for each of these and what would be considered a major. But we do spend time working with staff on ensuring that they understand what is a minor, what is something that they should be handling, and then what is something that needs to be passed off. Through all of this, part of it is we reinforce building that relationship with the family, the student, the parents, the extended family, whoever happens to be important in that child's life. Sometimes behaviors escalate, and we need to do something a little different. And this varies. These are the situations where an administrator needs to get involved. It's something where the chronics are now kind of happening over and over again. It's the teacher has done some in-class things, family is involved, but there still needs to be something a little more. The other pieces of when it escalates to a major are really around safety and additional items where it's prohibiting students from learning. Unsafe, theft, drugs, alcohol, some things that we're kind of tied to by the state. But we really do try to work with our teachers in working with the student to figure things out. What happens at this point is when an administrator gets involved, and in some cases, the administrator also has assistance. So if you're looking at an elementary school, the SBS might be getting involved, the school behavior specialist, in working with the student. In a middle school, it could be a vice principal, a principal, or even a school improvement coordinator. And then at the high school level, it could be a vice principal, a principal, or a dean. So there is additional supports built in. And those supplemental roles are to work on proactive pieces as well, working on some of the social skills of after the incident has happened, maybe conflict management, restorative pieces. It really varies based on the situation. There is quite a bit of discretion involved in this. I know that kind of one of the other questions that came up is what happens when a major is written? And again, that's going to vary a little bit, and Andy will talk about that in just a minute. But it could be anything from detention to a loss of activity to an apology, a conference, parent contact, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension. It's a pretty large spectrum based on what the incident was.
Okay, so we have, if you were to look in your packet and turn to where it says page 22, it's kind of right in the middle there where it says secondary discipline matrix for major behaviors. So this again comes out of the Student Rights and Responsibility Handbook, which is known to all families at the beginning of the school year. Now, as I mentioned what my grandma said, things don't always go smoothly all the time, so we have this for our administrators to use as simply as a guide, as Florence mentioned. Sometimes it's black and white in those decisions. A lot of times there's a lot of gray in between, and administrators use their judgment to make the most reasonable decision. So when you look at this matrix, as Florence said, it ranges from, at the end, it's screening, counseling, treatment, with the beginning kind of as loss of privilege. One thing that you see consistent on this matrix is kind of what we mentioned at the beginning of this, is what we pride ourselves on, is conferring with the student and working with the family. They're kids that we're working with, so we want to use those moments as teachable moments. Just as we make mistakes, kids make mistakes too. We don't want them to make the same mistakes twice, but we know that it happens. And so one of the things we do is we try to talk with the student and listen to the student in their decision on why they chose to do what they did, and always keeping the family involved. The good thing is because we talk about this at the beginning of the year, not all, but some parents know what this is, if they want to talk more about what discipline their child is experiencing. So if we were to role play for a second, let's say that we have an 8th grader, and the 8th grader is seen vandalizing a bathroom by ripping the paper towel dispenser off the wall. Not that that would ever happen in one of our middle schools. But let's say that it happened. So what would be the process, right? Well, what an administrator would do, like our administrators are seasoned enough that they probably don't look at this a ton, but we have it, and that's exactly what we have it for, is for guidance. So then they'd look down and they'd find, what would that be? Probably vandalism. And then they have this scope here to look at under vandalism in the secondary level. Now, this doesn't have to be used. It is a guide. There are times when it is used, and there are times where it's a guide, and it actually gives you a lot of leverage when you're talking with the kids. Like, here, this is what I'm supposed to do, but let's talk about what you did. What was secondary is different from primary. Secondary, you could say, what were you thinking? That doesn't really work as well with a first grader. But anyway, this is used as a guide. Want to talk a little bit with you about suspensions. One thing is you turn this page on the elementary discipline matrix. Look at the bottom, ladies and gentlemen, where it says for a student who is in 5th grade or lower, and I believe Ms. Franklin mentioned this earlier, Senate Bill 553, and that is, you know, there's only 3 reasons why we should be suspending students that are 5th grade or lower, and they're listed there. And so I just wanted to point that out to you, and I think that we, as a district, can do a better job of explaining that to our families too, because sometimes families ask a lot of questions with that. But basically with suspensions, we, you know, it's always our goal to keep the kids in school. That's the ultimate goal. It never feels good, sounds good to make the call to families and to suspend a kid from school. It's never what we want. We know that they can't learn unless they're in their seats. But sometimes, as I mentioned, kids make mistakes, and so we deal with those appropriately. One thing that's kind of interesting, I think it's good for you to hear, is that, and I know that our administrators know this as well, is sometimes when there is an unfortunate event and a child is suspended, it's a great opportunity to talk with the parent, as I mentioned, but it's also a really good opportunity to talk with the teacher and call the teacher down and say, hey, what happened here? And talk with them about, is there anything you could have done differently, or what was the trigger here? Because the goal is to only have it happen once, right? We don't want it to happen at all. But the goal is that it happens one time, so then we can hopefully teach the child the better behavior. So when we're talking in-school suspensions, those do happen. Basically, in the elementary school, it's typically in an office, in the main office, or in a buddy class. At the secondary level, there's usually a designated location with a staff member that can supervise that. But when we talk about out of school, again, goal to keep students in school, but suspension is always done by an administrator. Now, one important thing on this when you look at the board policy here, I think, is step 5. And step 5 is really important with our administrative team because it's where the reentry meeting happens, and sometimes there's a little bit of magic that happens there. Most of the time we want families to be present so we can talk through and we could hear their side. But most of the time it's where we designate together a plan to help support the student to reenter back into school safely. Maybe they're going to check in with the counselor more frequently. Maybe there's anger management that they're going to work on with our counselor. Maybe there's restorative practices or skills group. I mean, those lists go on and on. But and at times maybe they adjust their behavior support plan, or they maybe we decide to have an IEP meeting and tweak their IEP. But it's really important that, again, the goal is to keep them in school, and in this unfortunate event, and of course it does happen, then we want to make sure that we teach the children to have a different approach the next time. Now I'm going to turn over to Florence to talk about how we document our discipline on David Douglas.
So each time an incident happens, we encourage our staff to document it. A referral, whether it's a major or a minor, is meant to be a form of communication. And so in some of our buildings where referral numbers are really high, that's okay. It's all a form of communication. What the goal is to make sure is that the building leadership team, the staff, all understand what is kind of happening in their building. And we'd rather have really high numbers and be like, it's okay, we know what's going on, versus low numbers that are not accurate of what we're seeing or what parents are saying. And so we do take pride in making sure that everything is documented, because it is a form of communication. Documentation happens in a couple of different ways. We use an information system called Synergy. All referrals, majors and minors, go into Synergy. And some of that information then goes on to ODE. ODE receives our in-school suspensions and our out-of-school suspension numbers and any type of expulsions or pending expulsions. In addition, they receive information around weapons, and so we want to make sure that we are using Synergy to document those items as well. Another one that we use internally is called SWIS. It's, again, another form of an information system, but what this SWIS allows us to do is take the information from Synergy and allows us to analyze data in a simple format for our staff. We have staff who are trained teachers and a few teachers and administrators are trained in getting into the system to be able to pull out the information. That data is then used to make decisions. We want to make sure that as we're looking at behavior, we are making data-based decisions, not kind of going off of what we're feeling. In addition, we use that data frequently. So as we're looking at all of the different information we have, what you're seeing in the picture there is one way we share information with administrators. This is an administrative report that they get a couple times a year, and it's a reflection of what's going on, and a quick snapshot of what's going on in the building, and that comes from Andy and working with IT. And then we also look at all of our incidents, majors and minors, at least 4 times a year with all of our staff. And that's done in various staff meetings or data presentations or emails, but that is communicated out. In addition, buildings have a behavior team. And in that behavior team, one of the expectations is that they are looking at data school-wide monthly. They're looking for trends, they're looking for disproportionate data, they're looking to see if there's something like a spike, grade levels, they're kind of analyzing all of it, and SWIS allows us to do that. There is also another team that breaks down that information to another level that gives us student level data. And through that, we are then able to support individual students when we're seeing behavior starting to spike. The next kind of piece that I won't go into because this is a whole nother piece, but to kind of give you guys a snapshot is there is a multi-tiered system of support around behavior in our buildings. There's a green zone which focuses on all of the pieces that we just talked about. But then that data breakdown, that IPBIS team meeting that I said looks at data at least twice a month, looks to see if there are trends of students who are escalating in behavior by receiving multiple referrals. Whether they're major or minor, we look at all of that. And through that, we build in interventions of support for those students, monitor them, connect them with mentors, do a check-in, check-out, social skills. It really varies on what the need is, and then we try to meet that need. If behavior continues and students are really struggling, we look at something called Tier 3, which breaks down individual behavior support plans where teachers are involved, the admin team is involved, and we're working to find really what is the function of that behavior and how do we support that student in being successful at school. So that kind of goes into them.
Okay. Thank you, Florence. So as we come into a landing here, we're wrapping up, and we've been well, I think it's been 23 minutes, so we went over just a little bit. But again, it's really hard to try to do this in 20 minutes. And I know we're probably just scratching the surface, but up on the screen you'll see, again, just the David Douglas attitude that we try to instill and we look for when we hire people, is that we look for people. The top is the most important, that our students come first. We know that we're the adults and they're the kids. Finally, just in review tonight, folks, we talked a little bit about current disciplinary practices and procedures in the classroom and on school premises, talked about in-school and out-of-school suspension, talked about documentation of discipline. We talked about when situations escalate to the intention of an administrator. Now, our next steps, again, as I said, that you're looking down at the forest, we have a lot of work to do. In all transparency, we don't have this figured out. We have work to do. Our data shows that we have work to do. And the big one that we focus on is continuing to address student disparities. It's been kind of interesting for me, and part of my role is going out and meeting with principals this summer. And a lot of times I don't even have to show them this graph. They're already talking to me about it before I even bring it up. And so we do that through, we are constantly working to form better relationships with kids, reach out to families, connect them earlier and better, work with outside agencies better, and get their support. There's a lot of different things that we're working on to try to improve. Any questions because that's the conclusion of our presentation.
Anna?
Yes, thank you. I have a lot of questions. I think maybe what would make the best sense is I can send them to you all at some point, but I'll just kind of give a brief overview. I think this was really helpful. Thank you. As you know, my son's only in kindergarten, so I don't have that much experience with how discipline works in these schools, but I'm very fortunate to have enough close relationships with families and communities in the district to know that this is something that parents are often thinking about and trying to address. You know, we just had a big conversation about revenue and what we're doing with our sustainable education. And it's really important to me that we focus on our primary objective, which is to educate students. A lot of what I heard in this presentation around wanting to have an influence in creating a productive citizen, it doesn't seem to me to be as directly related to education. As a parent, I can say that the purview of moral development, behavioral standards, behavior modification lies within families, lies within communities. And I think it's dangerous to have a budget or to have an entire operation system that is really emphasized on what can be considered culturally subjective norms around peace and order in schools. A lot of what we talked about with the teacher having such a powerful role in classrooms could be a very kind of Western-centric notion of authority. When you're talking about, you talked about the rule of law, you talked about individual rights and property. Non-Western cultures would talk about freedom of creative expression and collaborative environments, stewardship, communal responsibility, shared authority. I'm thinking of how large of our population is immigrant and from communities of color, and the ways that children come into schools having a certain idea of what good behavior looks like may not perfectly match up with the traditional dominant culture model. So I think it's really important to consider that in our responses. I think it's really important to have consistency across the board around when and how the appropriate response is determined. Is it consistent across every school? Who that decider is? Is it consistent, in terms of thinking about trauma-informed methods? Is it consistent when you're thinking about the loss of instructional time? I would like to see a matrix that is less of a guide and a suggestion and more of a consistent standard, so kids are having the same experiences and parents are having the same experiences wherever they go throughout the district. I think it's great that we're looking at tracking disparities. It's not an indictment on this district that there is a prevalence of disproportionate discipline across race and ethnicity in public schools all over. So to be able to name that and say, we know this is a problem and we're very invested in working with families and communities to correct it. I think maybe I emailed you at some point, Ken, about translating our Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook because it had not yet been translated, and I have a hard time comprehending how a document that's so important in communicating and setting expectations isn't written in a language families can easily understand. I think that document should be something that's co-created and not set arbitrarily by us and then enforced within families. I think that there's a lot of value in having parents and families share with us what they consider good behavior and what their kids need in terms of behavioral standards that will promote their learning and promote what we talked about as our common goal, which is graduation rates. So just kind of moving us towards, is this disciplinary response going to lead to unnecessary loss of instructional time when we could think of other methods to address discipline? I think it's great that we have different approaches based on age. That's great. And I'm really encouraged by the overall values that we're bringing to this. I think that we can just do some tweaks to make it feel very culturally appropriate for families and to have that communicated from day one and to have it be a shared definition as opposed to when we're imposing onto families and communities.
If you're going to send your question.
I will send the whole list.
And on just one quick thing, clarification, just so you know, the elementary, they are all translated.
Right.
The middle, the student conduct code is translated.
Right.
But the student handbooks are not all. The secondary we
Okay.
talked about. The elementary actually is through a grant that we got them all translated. But the conduct code that was addressed is translated.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, any questions, Fendi? Anyone else?
Well, I don't really have a question, but I think that obviously a lot of thought has gone into this, and I want to commend you for what you've done in bringing it to the board. I guess one question is that I'm sure that you've thought of the processes that you've established here as a way to keep order in a classroom or in the school so that education can happen. I mean, I knew what the answer was going to be, but I mean, to me, that's obvious. The accountability, teaching responsibility and accountability is all part of the process, and I thank you for doing it.
Stephanie?
Yeah. I also have questions, thoughts, and I would just say that, like our dress code, this type of thing, it sometimes values are shared, sometimes they're not, right? That's the world we live in. And so I think the clearer that we can be on implementation, the better. That was something that we saw on the dress code, was that it didn't seem to be enforced in a way that was across all, individuals that are meant to enforce it. So I think that's one thing to consider, because some of these seem very subjective. What's considered a major vandalism, right, could be tearing something off the wall or your chips fall on the floor. I mean, honestly, like it could be interpreted many ways. Some of disrespect, defiance, what does that mean, right? And how does that, as an individual teacher, what you find disrespectful is very subjective. And so that's one thing, is just how it gets enforced, I think, is really, really important, and to make sure that it's enforced the same way. That although you saw this chart and we're like, oh, no charts, I'm like, I want a very specific chart, right? And people know exactly what is expected and what's going to happen. I would also wonder, because I know that trauma-informed practices have been a part of development of staff this year. And I know a little bit from Menlo that's been something that's been worked on in the elementary. I'm wondering how trauma-informed practices impact your take on discipline at the middle school and high school level, which is where we start to see like much more issues happening. How do you use trauma-informed practices when dealing with children in discipline environments? Maybe what we could do better.
Sure. Put it on the spot on the administrator.
Yeah.
So at Applesop, there's a number of things that we do, and again, I am new this year, okay? So I just a little bit of what I've done at Fur Ridge. So in the past, we had a number of students that came to Fur Ridge for a variety of different reasons. And when they were there, we knew that this is a kid that we just can't give up on. So some of our practices where we would spend time interviewing students, interviewing parents, just to ensure we did what worked best for the student. So part of our interview process, because we're new to our building, we would sit down, I think we had maybe 10 to 15 questions or so. And it would give us a better perspective of what type of student was coming into the building, what supports we needed to put in place, and we would also bring our teachers up to date on that information. I share with Florence, my last year at Fur Ridge, I did over 250 conflict resolutions. So basically giving our students the language they needed to say, I need to sit down and resolve a conflict with another student. Students would come in and request those conflict resolutions. And because we have such a small school, kids were going to see each other all the time, right? They respected the school enough to know, instead of fighting, I can go in and request conflict resolution. So ensuring our kids had a skill that they needed to be successful in the building.
Thank you. I'd love to see that everywhere. There were two other things I just wanted to note. One is the referral as a form of communication, that's kind of difficult because it's punitive, right? It's seen as punitive from the parent. It's seen as punitive from the child. I know my son has had referral. Like I have one of those kids that, you know, he can be a little bit of an issue. But that is often the only time, right, I hear from teachers, and I have twins. So I can tell you from my own experience the difference between a perfect model child, which is my daughter, and the one that's a little more difficult. I have much more forms of communication with teachers for him than I do from her. So I think we need to think about, you know, what messages we're sending in our communication with kids around discipline versus just general communication with parents that's needed. In the tracking of data, that, it's very important, and we need to do it, and we need to show it to the state. I do worry that could be seen as like almost a rap sheet, right, on a kid. That like if you get a kid with multiples going all the time, that there could be some judgment about that child, right? So I just would want to know that you're proactively looking at supporting those kids instead of like looking at it as, oh wow, we've got a problem kid. But like if you see that happening, how do you utilize the data? I saw a little bit of like intervention, but I'd be curious to know more. And we don't have to talk about it here. I feel like I have a lot of thoughts in reviewing this. Thank you.
And I think, Stephanie, you bring up a good point about trauma-informed and at the secondary level. And the big thing is, and I mentioned we have such big schools, is that we try to run our big schools like they're small schools. And you can't get a connection with a kid unless you listen to them. So trauma-informed, sometimes you just have to sit down and hear their story, or when you sit down with a parent, it's going to be some time, but that's what you have to do to figure out where it is they're coming from for the reason behind the way that they're communicating or acting, so then you can work on supporting them. So a lot of it comes from time. It just doesn't, I think when we make our mistakes is when we quick judge, or we make a drastic, like Baskin & Robbins, right? It's just drive through discipline. We just can't do that, and we try really hard not to do that.
I think there's value in that individualized approach, definitely. I did want to clarify, I love the matrices, and I would like to see them, yes, more detailed, but also to take away some of that subjectivity and any implicit bias, wherever it exists, from the disciplinary process, right? And I would love to see it including non-punitive measures, restorative measures, trauma-informed measures, and I would love to see a reduction in loss of instructional time wherever and whenever possible.
Okay. Any other?
Yeah, just one. Not necessarily for you two, though I'm sure you will probably be involved. I know that I have pretty much unfettered access to the building administrators already, but I do want to talk with you, Andy, sometime probably in September, right? Not that you have to prepare a lot for this, but just I'm going to be on vacation. I want to talk about Senate Bill 553, and specifically this year I want to talk about, because we talk about it every year, I want to talk about what are we doing to educate our teachers on how to handle situations that normally would have been handled in the past through suspension. I will make a sort of a broad brush statement that I cannot back up other than just my belief. Our teachers do not report consistently when there has been instances of a student causing physical harm to another student or a teacher. So I want some information around that, and plenty of notice. I'm not.
No, I would just say, yeah. And I mean, it is true that a lot of those behavioral issues are staying in the classroom. And we saw that, we've heard presentations by folks who work with kids, like on discipline issues in elementary schools. I myself have a kid who had 6 room clears in 1 year, meaning it was unsafe to be in the room. Like, these are real issues. I'm not, discipline is a real issue, right? But we just want to see consistency and supportive environments for especially culturally responsive and trauma-informed.
Okay. Any other questions on the plan?
I have questions and comments. So, one, thank you both again, not only for the information, but for starting at 9. I know it's really late for you all. I just recognize that and appreciate it, because this is a really important conversation. I particularly like the definitions pages, and I'm wondering, is that information that is available to parents and students in translated format?
were developed by a team of teachers and administrators and then aligned with national PBIS kind of feedback as well. They are not translated, but they are available on the website under Student Services, under PBIS, under Behavior Handbook. So the it's a little complicated to get in there, but as we kind of look at making things more accessible, I know that as Student Services Department, we are working to make our website more robust so it is user-friendly. The Behavior Handbook was developed by a variety of folks a few years ago, and that's what's used as the guide, and the pages are within that. I think if we're looking at translating and doing some of those pieces, that it's a real possibility if we're all going to land on that's what we believe the definitions are.
Okay, I would definitely recommend or want to see not only a translation, but as we really are being intentional about decreasing the digital divide too, about looking at other ways to provide this information for students and families, because I do think that it's helpful to know exactly what the parameters are around vandalism or any of these. And then a couple other things I had. One, turning to the policy committee. Did you know this is coming? I would be interested. I saw that some of these actually have, it's been a couple of years for review. I would love the opportunity to do that. Happy to be helpful in that. And I think particularly the ones that I saw were the suspension and the student discipline one, since it looks like the other one we reviewed earlier this year.
If I could just say that if you're that happy, board leadership will be assigning committee members, and you.
Choose me.
Touche.
The Equity Committee is also looking at possibilities, whether it's a separate racial justice independent standing policy or a sort of omnibus policy that will address discipline as part of it. So we can I would love to, cross-pollinate policy, equity, and figure out how we can address a lot of these solutions. Mostly just modernize. I don't think there's anything bad in here, but we just need to bring it up to date.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I think we can do both. And that was actually the last thing that I had, was that it would be really helpful to have the Equity Committee moving forward, particularly look at the data around the racial disparities, but also as we look at other practices around cultural competency, which I know we're really all aligned in that value. I think this would be a great fit for the Equity Committee to really continue to analyze and then come back to us and share kind of what the data has been saying. So that's all I had.
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for all you do all the time. Yeah.
And one last thing I will say, I know that you're all busy and you all have kids in the district in and out, but I would encourage you, go into our classrooms and see our teachers at work. I mean, there's two of us. The work that the teachers do under some pretty unbelievable circumstances, amazing. What our kids can do to get to that slide where they're all graduating. It's not an easy job, and we all know that, and they know that going in, and we remind them of that. But our teachers are pretty amazing in this district. They are the ones that are making it happen. Well, thank you.
I was going to say, I'm just going to add on to that and piggyback a little bit. If anyone is interested in seeing how that IPBIS team works and the conversations that take place around looking at student behavior and being proactive in interventions, just let me know, and you can come along with me. So.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I guess we're going to finally get to superintendent's report.
So, I know I say it often. I try to be brief because I do try to keep you updated along the way, but I honestly mean it this time. I will be brief, but there's a few things I do want to just bring to the table and make sure we have an understanding of, and of course, always allow for questions. But number one, I want to reach out and publicly recognize and welcome Miss Mary Pearson, our new Student Services Director, a new teammate at the table, and we just want to welcome you and thank you so much for being here. excited to have her. We had our first cabinet meeting that she could attend today, so cabinet meeting and board meeting all on the same day, and she's still here. So thank you so much, Mary. We really appreciate it and look forward to working with you. With that said, a couple things, updates. Number one, I wanted to reach out and update just because it's a little bit touch and go, and it always is with construction, summer construction in a school district, because you have a 10-month or 10-week window, and it's timing's tough with it. And the district office construction is going fine, and really there's no time frame there. There's not an issue. But the Alice Ott Middle School construction is literally day by day. So just keeping you informed. The last update we had, they felt they were on schedule and we're going to make it, and that's what we're just going to keep doing. But I would be less than transparent if I said, oh, no, there's not a worry. There is a little bit of a worry. Will we make it through? And I'm sure Tay's real excited to hear that back there. But yeah, we're definitely, they're doing their best, and I can say there's nothing that says we are not going to make it. No one said that yet. It's not like there's materials held up somewhere or anything. It's just tight. And to be quite honest, that building is old, and as you uncover things, it's just something new pops up. So just a heads up there. Number one, just a real quick reminder, the Deerdorf easement, we had a request from the city of Portland. Nothing's happened with that. They're planning to come next month to our board meeting if it works in the agenda process, but they will be here to kind of update us and go through that process. The next one I really want to make sure that I get on the table is the Hanson building. You guys all know 122nd and Gleason, the Hanson building. It has been identified as surplus, although it's been identified as surplus for many, many years. I asked Pat volunteered, whatever you want. She went to a public meeting and she did testify about that building, the use for it, and she publicly communicated our interest in that building. And we followed up with that. I just want the board to know we followed up with a letter to the county leadership saying that we are very interested, and if it does actually follow through with surplus, we'd like to be in line for that and communicate with that. With all that said, I want to share that with you because no one is committed to buying anything. That goes through you first. But if you did hear, obviously many of you are connected with many different public officials, district's buying Hanson. That is not true, but we have communicated that we're interested in that property and it would be a good piece of property for our district. So just so you guys know that, we're clear with that. Also following up, we have a classified member in the audience, and I wanted to share today, we did go through and had a bargaining session with classified. If you remember, we communicated with our classified personnel leadership that we're planning to change payroll, and we currently are monthly payroll, and we're going to twice a month payroll. There's a number of reasons, but the major reason for that is because we found that if you look at payroll dates monthly, there is an option, an opportunity where we could possibly be out of compliance because we have too many days in between pay dates, and that's not okay. We want to be in compliance. So we did communicate. They immediately got back to us with a request to bargain. We went through the process. I can say my opinion, it went very well today is the update I had, and ultimately I can say that the communication is they want to make sure no one's caught off guard and no one is impacted negatively about it. If you think about someone that is getting paid at the end of the month, they have bills the first 10 days and now they're only getting half their payment. They just want to make sure there's a bridge, if you will, to support that it's clear with everyone and that we're treating people with right during the process, I think is what we heard. But so I think we're all on the same page with that, but more to come as we go through it. I think the others, I'll skip. I do have another business. I'll mention it now and we can talk about it. We are looking at a possible lease of the Elk property for a construction company doing construction. But in other business, if I can have 2 minutes, I'll update and everything else. One more thing I just want to recognize, and I do want to recognize all the programming that's happening in our schools. We're no longer a 9-month organization. As you know, schools year-round with Sun School, with EKT, early kindergarten transition. At the high school, there's somewhere around 430 students showing up for Sun School, summer school, credit recovery across the board. We have feeding going on at every elementary school. Most of our middle schools, obviously construction in one, but the feeding through the months of June summer programming, over 414 breakfasts, over 5,000 lunches. For this month alone, projections are well over 20,000 lunches, well over 10,000 breakfasts served for our community. Obviously, that's a positive, and we're proud of that. And that's in conjunction with all the programming, hopefully to bolster academic and achievement of students. So with that said, the rest of them I'll save, Madam Chair.
Okay. Next item, financial report, Pat?
I'm going to try to be very brief. So this is, I think it got emailed to you this afternoon. It's at your table. Primary component is general fund, and at that we're seeing the ending fund balance higher than projected. I do want to bring to your attention, we were notified from the county that the Comcast settlement, they're expecting a payment of almost $40 million from Comcast by the middle of August. Of that share, I think we have about $550,000 anticipated coming due. So I'm guessing that that will actually bring up our local revenues for the 18-19 year, that they won't ask us to accrue it to last year. Depends on when the timing of the payment is and when they get it out, but I'm guessing it's going to be 18-19. Also included is an update on the investment report. It's pretty dry as usual. And so if you have any other questions or concerns, if you want to ask or want to email me later, that'd be great.
Okay. No questions or?
Just check out my forethought to ask my questions earlier today, knowing the meeting would be this way.
Okay, the next consent agenda item. Does anyone want anything pulled? If not, do I have a motion to approve them?
I move that we approve the consent agenda as written.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. Any discussion? Okay, none. Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those against? Okay, approved unanimously. Okay, now we're on to Superintendent's 2017-18 evaluation, and it is our practice to have the board chair of that year to present it. So I'm turning it over to Christy.
Thank you, Frida. Okay, I just wanted to go over real quick to make sure everybody understands what our process is. By law and policy, we're required to do this each year. So our policy is that there's a period in the beginning of the year where goal setting happens. And then in June, the board gets together and we discuss the goals and whether they were met or not met. There's only pass or fail here. And there's a little bug here too with me. And then in July, the board chair submits to the superintendent the formal summary of the board's rating of the 3 general goal areas. So Frida and I met with Ken and went over the full evaluation. And so the law says I have to report to you that we did do that. That's what the law is. Along with that, we'd like to thank Ken for this past year. It's, there's a lot of things going on in Portland and in our schools, and so I think it was all handled really well. I was really appreciative of when I had to get interviewed when the student walkouts for the March for Your Life type events happened, that I was very happy to say we respect our students' right to free speech, and we're preparing for that and preparing a safe space for them to meet outside when they walk out. So I felt really good about being able to report things like that and not being that district that was, we're going to suspend all those students or anything crazy like that. So I think we had a really good year. We made some really good progress on the goals, and obviously they're ongoing. They're not a one-year goal. These are long-term goals that we have to get through.
Okay. Would anyone else like to make any comments?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of benefit in having a very simplified instruction or sheet where you're meeting all expectations, but it doesn't fail to capture, I think, all the ways you've gone above and beyond, and being very responsive to many new board members, being very just willing to try new things and willing to have some difficult conversations. But I think for a common goal and a common vision, I really appreciate that you've taken the time to meet with all of us. And I think you're establishing a really positive culture of collaboration, and your support of the equity committee and all the new kind of initiatives that we're exploring and thinking about together just speaks to, I think, your adaptability, and that's not captured on the sheet, so I just wanted to say that publicly.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I too, as the new board member, in fact, this July meeting is like the 1 year anniversary of us coming onto the board. So happy 1 year to Anna.
Happy 1 year.
And as somebody who's new, I just want to appreciate, as Anna said, you going above and beyond. Really, any time that there was a question that I had, emails were responded to within hours, if not like the hour. Phone calls would be immediately responded to. You know, when I asked what was happening after the racist graffiti incident, you were really respectful. You brought the community together. You were there yourself. And I really feel supported, and I feel like it's also the team you're building. Like, I just can't say enough about the cabinet. I mean, the respect that they have for you and that you have for them is so clear. And so I just want to thank you for the team. It's like you're like, this is my team. These are my players. All right, what can we do together? And so I really appreciate your enthusiasm. I appreciate your optimism. You know, you're always a very positive person to be around. And so thank you for making my first year a really great one on the board. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you, Ken. What is this? My 27th evaluation of a superintendent. And what most people don't realize that it is the board's biggest. We only do two things where they're big. We hire a superintendent and we evaluate a superintendent. So it's kind of a big responsibility that we have, but you made the job easy this year. Thank you. So, and as we discovered, it's not an action item. We just have to report it. So if there's no other comments, we'll move on to other business. Is there, Ken, you said you had one, so you might as well bring it up first.
You bet. I'll go first. And first, can I just say thank you? Thank you for the confidence. Thank you for the communication. And thank you for your leadership. Obviously, what you do here is voluntary, one, but the impact is enormous, right? We're talking about kids. We're talking about future. And I don't think any of you takes that lightly, and that excites me. And you did mention, and they just left, unfortunately, you mentioned cabinet, which is amazing, best in the state. And I'm not just saying that. You could ask around. But our administrators as well in our buildings, they are top-notch, first class. So with all of that said, yes, so we have had a request from a construction company to lease space, and I'll probably just turn it over to Pat here, but to lease space at our Elks, basically the parking lot at the Elks, as they're doing construction to stage some of their equipment, some of their materials. We would like to approve that and move forward with that. One, it gets eyes on the ground, gets materials there. We would ensure they have insurance. We would ensure there's background. We think it's a good thing. There's not really hurt there, but we did want to communicate with the board as well, and if there's any red flags or concerns you'd like us to consider, we go from there. Pat, is there anything I'm missing? I know I'm overgeneralizing, but...
Yeah, I don't think so. They're doing construction of some housing units down a little west of us on Irving. So between, it looks like Gleason and Irving, there's quite a huge complex going in.
There's affordable housing complex going in there.
And there's not a lot of construction space, so they were admiring our space.
How much of the area are they wanting?
I think they would end up probably using the whole lot.
Okay.
But
I don't know, Christina talked at some point, if we aren't building for a while, making it where the food carts are.
Well, we joked because they asked if they could trade maintenance for the building, and we kind of joked and said, how about demo of the building? And they were like,
No, I didn't want food carts. I wanted paid parking, monthly parking that was secure. That's what I was after.
Okay. I'm fine with any of those uses as long as I can pay $200 million.
We wish.
I like your style.
Do you need us vote on it, or is it just, can we just?
We just wanted to know if you're okay with us continuing. They came in and wanted to know if that was a possibility, and so they had offered leasing, and we just thought we would come and ask you if you were interested in us pursuing.
There might be an action next board meeting, but we didn't want to move forward.
Well, it just seems like any money we can make off the property while it's sitting there, we should do it. Okay, any other business?
Yeah.
Pat.
So you have two items. You have one that is marked other business, and it's a purchase, as Derek's over here really bouncing up and down because you approved his grant. Now he wants to spend it.
Oh.
So there's Chromebooks in there, and then there's some additional contracts. And then there is an oops. So there is a correction to the 2018-19 adopted budget resolution. There's actually two items that need to be corrected. In the paragraph on the fiscal year, we had the beginning date right, but we had the ending date ending before the year began. So that changed from June 30 of 2018 to June 30, 2019. And then we also had a little dyslexic moment down in the debt service fund. It should have been $3,273,441 in the PERS debt fund, and we had 411. So we're asking you to approve those. I know that's a lot.
Can we do them together?
You can. That's up to you.
Okay. Do I have a motion?
I move to approve the additional purchasing and contracts that are on this piece of other business, and I move to also approve the correction to the 2018-19 adopted budget resolution.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? All those in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes. Okay, no other business? Board member reports. Kyle?
Pass.
Christine?
Pass.
Anna?
Two quick updates. One, I wanted to apologize that I was not able to attend the last scheduled equity committee. I had a personal crisis to deal with, but we are taking a couple months off for summer, and then we're going to convene and get back to work. Also, a couple weekends ago, I attended OSBA's Board of Directors meeting as part of my role as co-president of the newly formed School Board Members of Color Caucus. I think a lot of what we're doing is the best in the state, and I think it's a really great opportunity to share out best practices statewide and have a wider impact than just beyond our neighborhood. We were successful in petitioning OSBA to allocate $40,000 for that caucus. So we'll be working to build power for new school board members of color and figure out how to best advocate for children of all underrepresented backgrounds, but especially children of color. So that was a really positive experience, and that's all.
Okay. Bryce? Stephanie? Aloya? Haven't done too much. I do want to let people know that on Tuesday the 17th, I believe it's at 6:30 at ERCO, they're having a discussion of the 102nd and Pacific project that Prosper Portland's presenting. Also, I was officially signed in as a member of the A Home for Everyone's commission. So I'll be starting that, and they have work groups, so I'm going to see what will best benefit the district and stuff. But I'm the only member of their large commission that knows anything about schools. So it's going to be kind of an interesting discussion, I think. So, and other than that, my understanding is the new affordable housing on 105th is already taking applications for residents. And 16 of the units will be set aside for homeless people to get into, so they have to be on the list. And I believe I tied Florence into the connection. Yeah, connection, yeah. My goal is to get all these housing groups to understand how important schools are and families are, and can you please talk to the schools? So that's my goal. So anyway, but that's it for this right now. Okay, then if there's nothing else, the meeting's adjourned.